Cool. So Elizabeth, Director of Content Marketing at Crunchy Data, it's an honor to have you on the Geospatial Index.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. It's nice to meet you.
You too. All right, so let's get straight into it. What is the elevator pitch for Crunchy Data?
So Crunchy Data is a Postgres company. So Postgres is an open source relational database platform. And Crunchy Data does distributions of Postgres on sort of the host of your choice. So if you're hosting in public cloud, we have a managed cloud service. If you're like self-hosting in Kubernetes, or maybe you're a large enterprise and you're self-hosting on-prem, we help you kind of deliver a large package of Postgres. So PostgreSQL, the software itself, when you get it from the community, comes as a sort of one piece, which is the database. But to run it in kind of an enterprise environment, you need a lot of other components, right? You need backups, you need high availability, you need probably some kind of replication so that your data goes other places. And so we kind of package all of that together. So we're kind of a managed services company for PostgreSQL. And then sort of the geospatial component, like the reason that kind of we're talking is PostGIS, which is the spatial extension for Postgres, sort of makes Postgres itself into like a geospatial database. And PostGIS is packaged with all the distributions that we offer. And so, a lot of the things that we're doing at Crunchy Data are about databases. And then, some component of that is about the spatial databases itself. So we have kind of a special relationship with PostGIS and the spatial database world. We employ two of the main maintainers of PostGIS. They work at Crunchy Data. And so they were sort of very embedded into the engineering that's happening in PostGIS and some of the other things. So we'll talk more about that as we kind of get into the podcast. But yeah.
All right. Suffice to say, I feel like I've hit the jackpot when it comes to open source GIS implementations. So yeah, really looking forward to this.
Okay, awesome. Yeah.
Cool. So I think you basically covered off the next question as well, which is what niche you dominate. Do you have any extra comments before we skip to the next question?
Yeah, I mean, the niche that we dominate is really people looking to do either PostgreSQL or Postgres with PostGIS, or maybe Postgres with vector data. People that are, startup businesses, software as a service. We do a lot of people building in open source frameworks, right? And then we have a pretty big footprint in kind of the large enterprise world. We're Red Hat partners. So we do a lot of we have a lot of banks and United States federal government and stuff like that. So, we have a pretty broad spectrum customer base, from big, 3-letter federal agencies all the way down to kind of people sort of building their first application.
Okay, that's a really good point to make, actually. When I was doing a little bit of research before we started, I saw that you seem to be at a conference where the Department of Defense, for example, was involved. So I think it's important to flag that it's open source, but it's trusted by these larger organizations, which have a lot of responsibility for robust implementations of these systems.
That's true. So Crunchy Data has kind of a cool history. The original founders were involved with a couple databases back in even the 80s and 90s. I don't know if you're familiar with a database platform called Sybase. So one of the this was kind of an older database platform that's kind of out of fashion now, but was heavily used by United States federal government agencies. And so the Crunchy Data founders were heavily involved in database stuff with Sybase, with Oracle, with some of the bigger enterprise stuff. And they kind of saw the road ahead, right, with open source. And they started Crunchy Data to sort of help get some reliable Postgres services into the federal government. So Crunchy Data, I think, is 14 years old now. Very much started as working with those big agencies, working in kind of that big enterprise environment that you would typically associate with like an Oracle or an Esri or something like
Yeah.
that. And then we did quite a bit of work early on with Postgres. So Crunchy Data has several people that do development on the Postgres platform itself. That's kind of part of our business model, right? And that's common in open source business models that you'll have a services part of the organization, and then you'll have part of the organization that's doing engineering on the underlying platform,
Yeah.
which is then, given to the whole community to use, right? So any engineering work that we do on Postgres, anyone could use, but it benefits the larger community, and then it also benefits the company. And so we early on put a lot of things inside Postgres to make it something that you could use at an enterprise scale, right? Things like role level security,
Wow.
some of the bigger security features Crunchy's been involved with.
All right,
Yeah.
that comprehensively, addresses the concerns that some organizations might have about the perceived, I guess I don't want to use this word, but for lack of a better word, perceived jankiness or lack of security, perhaps, or lack of maturity around open source offerings. So I think you've comprehensively disposed of those concerns.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting world. In security, I just actually gave a security talk in New York, and it's just like a fascinating, right? The supply chain security for all software is something that everybody is thinking about. I mean, even closed source stuff like, SolarWinds, like that's a closed source software offering, right? That's not an open source piece of software. And they had a huge supply chain hack. They had
Right.
somebody get into the code base,
Yeah.
somehow got some credentials, somehow created legitimacy for themselves, and then was able to kind of run away with it and put a bunch of malicious code into SolarWinds. So, that's definitely true, right? There's supply chain issues with all software now. Like I think we all know that, right? We live in that world.
Yeah, we're almost all just waiting, for the next hack. And come to think of it, actually, when I did an interview with Linda Stevens, that was around the time that Snowflake was also penetrated. So
Yeah,
yeah,
that's the Snowflake thing is super interesting. I have a friend at Snowflake, and just watching that play out this year has been super interesting. And
yeah,
I think you think that, a lot of people who, especially if you're involved in database engineering at a lower level, you're concerned about, encryption and TLS handshakes and certs, and like you're concerned about, some pretty deep, complicated fundamentals. And the thing that brings all of this stuff down is always like simple stuff, right? Like what brought the Snowflake thing down was, MFA, right? Like
right.
they had a bunch of orgs that didn't have MFA, and they all used the same contractor, and somebody put his credentials in a Jira ticket, and
Yeah, wow,
like,
just like that.
yeah.
Yeah, I didn't actually know that. So there we go. Learning with every episode. Okay. All
Yeah.
right. So we've started to look, I think, at your ideal customer, or at least you mentioned that commonly you are serving some larger organizations. Would you say that a large three-letter government agency is an ideal customer, or is it something else, or is it just too hard to nail down?
I think there's a big range of ideal customers, right? Like I don't think that there's one ideal customer. And I like one of my roles at Crunchy is in kind of that content marketing, right? And so I'm thinking about who those people are and what those people are looking for. And there's a little bit of a different profile, but there's kind of, I would say there's sort of three customer profiles that I think about pretty often, right? One is that large enterprise, three-letter agency. They're very concerned about security. They're probably self-managing some kind of database operation. They're probably doing some kind of mix, right? They probably have, if they're a spatial org, they probably have Esri stuff in there somewhere, right? They probably have some Oracle. They probably have some Microsoft SQL Server. But they're exploring open source, and they want to know, they're adopting open source with new projects. That's a pretty typical customer profile for us. Then you've kind of got your medium-sized business, right? They're not, they're not brand new. Some of their engineers have been around, right? Their engineers aren't building their first app. They've built a couple apps. They've got a little bit of, maybe they've got a little bit of venture capital funding. Like they've got some juice, right? They're building in open source because they know that helps them with velocity, it helps them with cost, and then there's, a ubiquitous understanding amongst their engineers who are in whatever open source framework, if it's Python, if it's Ruby on Rails, if it's Java, whatever, and they're familiar with Postgres. And so Postgres is kind of the choice. I see that more and more now than I did 5 or 10 years ago, where there's no question that Postgres is the database that you would want to use. And then, I also think that the new people are important too, right? Like the people who've never built an app, who are either students or maybe just experimenting with development. And so, I want to make sure that anything I'm doing for the community, I kind of try to include those people too, because those are the people who are going to build the big apps and the bigger stuff later, right?
That's
so
the
you
thing.
kind of
It
have
makes
to
me,
keep
I
them.
wish that we'd come across each other during 10 years ago when I was a student.
Yeah, and I mean, isn't that like, that's such an interesting idea, right? That one of the things that we deal with, especially when you're talking about geospatial stuff, is Esri is just ubiquitous in education.
Exactly.
Like they have done such a great job of like, whatever their little kind of software deals are and however they kind of get it implemented in schools. And so everybody comes out of university knowing some kind of Esri. Like I have an archaeology background,
All right.
which of course I'm using every day now. But yeah, my original career was in archaeology, and we used ArcGIS, right? Everything I learned about geospatial data, my very first database that I ever worked in was ArcGIS.
File
So
geodatabase.
yeah.
Personal geodatabase.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah.
And I'll attach to that every environmental science student as well.
Yeah, exactly.
And of course every GIS student. Yeah. So no, okay, great. And I hope that this podcast adds to this effort. To compete with Esri. Capture student mindset.
And I think it's fun. And I do think like occasionally there are, I do a lot of open source advocacy. I have kind of like an open source geospatial stump speech that I'll give at, different developer events, like, and people love it, right? Like, I gave this talk in Kansas City. We have a little developer conference here, which is actually not little anymore. It's huge. There's like 4,000 people. But I'll do like just how do you make a map with free software, right? And you don't have to be a GIS person. You don't have to be a software developer. Like I can show you in 60 minutes how to, install a database, how to install the front end, how to get a shape file, from your city or whoever you want to get a shape file from. Like, there's lots of people that have data, and then there's lots of base maps, and then you can make a map, right? Like you don't need to be an engineer, and you can just install this stuff on your MacBook or whatever you're using, and you're like off and running. So it's kind of like, I think open source gives people the ability to do things, like you can sort of create a bigger world of geospatial users. That's like kind of the cool thing.
Yeah, I know now what I'm doing in the hour after this episode. So thanks for that.
Yeah.
Okay,
we'll get you started.
Yeah, perfect. All right. So how does the owner, management, and staff have skin in the game at Crunchy Data?
So Crunchy has kind of your standard employee shareholder kind of setup, right?
Cool.
And those are always great. I think the last 5 or 10 years, there's obviously a lot of interest in data storage, right? I think as the modern application framework, we've kind of taken a lot of the pieces that build the web application. It's all like kind of infrastructure as code, right? It's very easy to change where you're doing your infrastructure for the front end. You've got a lot of choices on where to host that. Data is harder to move, right? It's ephemeral, it's there, like it's stateful storage, like if you're talking about this Kubernetes world. So I think people recognize now in terms of like who's looking at where to put investment money in, companies that are building infrastructure and building data, that there's a lot of eyes on Postgres right now, right? There's a lot of
Interesting.
interest in it, and it's become kind of like I feel like every other week I wake up and there's like a new managed services Postgres company out. Like I don't know if you kind of live in this world, but it's there's a lot happening. Um
I'm
and
happy to be doing the research via this
yeah,
discussion.
it's
I'll
very
take all the
cool. And
information I can
and
get.
and lots of people are doing really interesting stuff. And so the employee shareholder stuff is great. And then, the fact that Crunchy was kind of in on this ground level, really a pretty big player in the Postgres space, is helpful for everybody at the company, right? Because there's kind of this big world where, okay, if you want to go do something else, there's kind of a lot of options for you now, for engineering.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
Crunchy itself is building some really cool stuff, and that really helps. And in the open source world, it's the passion for engineering projects is kind of different, right? If you're working at a company like Esri, or a closed source company, they're sort of dictating how the code is being made, right? There's kind of a central organization, there's a central idea, everyone's kind of moving in a direction, and that's all sort of organized at a larger corporate level. Open source tends to be much more passion driven, interest driven, and even inside Crunchy Data, they're very encouraging of you to do the things that you want to do the things that interest you. And that's really common across, like, this isn't the first open source company I've worked at. It's very common. So that's kind of an interesting difference, right? And that
Okay.
helps the talent and engineering talent you're able to recruit at a company like Crunchy Data, when people know they can sort of do the things that interest
Yeah.
them
That's
and
another source of
build.
incentives. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly. You get what I'm
Okay.
saying.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. All right. So then, how fast and sticky is growth?
Um, in terms of sticky, I assume you're talking about kind of how the business model works, and like, is
Recurring
it
customers. I
recurring
mean,
customers? Yeah. So, I mean, most of our stuff is sold as like subscription revenue and not professional services. So that's, I don't know how much you know about open source, but the open source world, 10 years ago, was almost all the money was made in consulting, right? Just time and materials consulting. A lot of people, Crunchy Data included, and new companies have started to figure out that, that's not the way you scale a business, right? You can't build products and you can't make products better, unless you have recurring subscription revenue. So that's kind of what we're doing, and that's pretty common, I think, in the industry.
all right, so we came across each other on LinkedIn when I was complaining to Felt, and I feel that I have a right to do that because I've had John on, that Esri's project delivery subscription for exposing maps to external staff costs too much.
Yeah.
And you said then that one can set up maps using PostGIS and open source tools for the web, and I'm going to recite an actual, I guess, tool name here, PG_FeatureServe and PG_TileServe, with
Yep.
100% open source. So what's PostGIS? You've started to talk about that a bit, but maybe a bit more detail there. And what do these two PG_star tools do?
Okay. Yeah. So maybe we'll start big picture, right? So there is an organization called the Open Source Geospatial Foundation, OSGeo for short. You can look them up. That is a foundation that supports open source software in a similar manner as like the Apache Foundation, right? Under the umbrella of OSGeo, they have the database project PostGIS, and then a bunch of things underneath that are libraries that let you build PostGIS and other spatial tools, right? So things like the GEOS library, the GDAL library, all of that. Okay, so you've got your data storage. Also part of the OSGeo world is QGIS, which is the front end mapping application. I haven't seen ArcGIS in a long time, but I think I think they play kind of in the same
Yeah, they do
sandbox.
similar
Like,
things.
Okay, yeah, they do similar
But I
things.
should say that QGIS plays nicer with felt oh yes with felt because there's a plugin, but it also plays more nicely with Speckle than ArcGIS Pro last time I tried, just to
Okay.
say.
Yeah, so you've got your map application. So let's say you want to build, you want to actually deliver some kind of map, either a printed map or a wall printed map, or you're gonna do some kind of work on maps. You do that in the QGIS app. Also, part of the open source Geospatial Foundation is like a map server piece called GeoServer, and that lets you sort of serve things that you've built in QGIS, or maybe just data from PostGIS from the database underneath. And that will expose that publicly, on some kind of website, or deliver that in some format. There's a bunch of other projects under the hood for OsGeo, but those are kind of the big pieces, right? So you can kind of do all the things that that people are doing with the Esri ArcGIS world to, get map data, to create maps, and then to serve them to some kind of website. The PG Feature Serve and the PG Tile Serve are open source projects that we maintain at Crunchy Data, and they're they're kind of not under the overarching like support of OsGeo. PG Feature Serve and PG Tile Serve come in to the sort of mapping world when so let's take it one step back. If you're building a front end application, right? Let's say you're almost certainly building a front end application in some kind of JavaScript, right? Like it's
Yep,
your
commonly.
React, your whatever flavor of JavaScript this month. Like we're using a
Sure.
JavaScript framework called Remix right now at Crunchy Data to build our front end. Um, the way that all these server side applications run is that they want all of this stuff fed to them via API, right?
Yep.
And they want, the data and whatever it's going to render on this front end JavaScript app to come from API. So PG Feature Serve and PG Tile Serve basically expose geospatial data from a database through an API.
Mhm.
And so what that gives you is the ability, and it's kind of like you would call it middleware, I guess. Like it's a
Yep.
little tiny it's a Go application. It's a little piece of middleware, and then that just lets you build whatever you want. So like, for example, I do like a short demo that I'll do as a talk for Feature Serve and Tile Serve, where I'll build a little database, I'll put some data in it, and then I'll use like the Open Layers project. That's a JavaScript kind of HTML thing, and this is all exists like on GitHub if you want to find it. So you can basically take Open Layers, feed your little API, and then you can build your little Open Layers map. And so you're paying for the database, right? Because geospatial data isn't free to host. But these little front end applications are just little teeny tiny servers, right? And you're serving up map data to whatever public thing you've got. Does that
Right,
make
right.
sense?
Yeah. I mean, I'm keen to try it all out now. I sort of feel like there needs to be another step where I do that and then yeah, come
Okay.
back with more
Yeah.
questions. But yeah, thanks for I guess the tour through all the different types of tools that one would need to, I guess, deploy to begin to save a lot of money. In the face of, for example, the project delivery subscription and all the other tooling that's related to that. Cool. Okay, so let's consider a medium-sized engineering consultancy serving maybe 20 projects. Each project has a web map with maybe a gigabyte of data delivered via a mixture of vector and raster layers. And then each external organization that these projects relate to has, say, 20 staff that want to browse their project map simultaneously. So walk us through the setup for this system and the contrast with Esri Enterprise. Comments on server OS requirements are
Okay.
welcome.
And so let me just clarify. I read this question ahead of time. So your primary goal here is just to deliver the maps themselves, right? So the actual physical map is the deliverable. Is that kind of the
Yeah, so
deal?
there's no physical maps involved here. So I mean, as I said, I guess when we when I was sort of introducing myself before we started recording, since 2011, basically, I have had a career in various engineering consultancies from Australia to the Middle East, to the UK now. And basically, the theme is that every project, starting with doubling the size of a gas field in southeast Queensland in Australia, all the way to what was a recent project I was on, for example, in the southwest of England, a small 4 kilometre highway bypass. All of these projects, there's an expectation that there's a web map that's exposed to client staff, that's maintained by the consultancy, that shows all of the design layers, all of the authority layers, all of the buried utility layers, as a sort of a visual common data environment. So the
Yeah.
standard way is just to deploy Esri Enterprise usually, or ArcGIS Online, some sort of Esri tooling, to place that web map before project staff. So I'm just curious about that typical GIS analyst, considering. Curious to hear how we could assist that GIS analyst to change over to open source as the
Yeah.
go-to.
So I think there's probably a variety of different ways that people are achieving that in open source, right? I mean, I think you're starting with that common database platform, right? You're starting with PostGIS as the data layer. And then you're probably using some kind of QGIS. Now, if you're just doing a simple delivery of a simple web map, you could probably use like a geo server, tied to your database, and then, or, a little bit of QGIS if, you're just sharing maps amongst an office. I think if you get into the interactive maps where it's a more full featured application, right? Where you're clicking on layers, you're zooming out, like, and then, depending on the amount of data you want to show, you might be building some kind of, front end application using like the tool chain I was talking about with some flavor of JavaScript, and then maybe a feature server, a tile serve layer. So I think it's a big world of choices, right? I don't think it's a super simple answer.
Mm.
Um, and I think the other thing that is sort of a little bit of a mountain to climb for most people is the engineering time involved, right? I think what you probably get out of the box with an Esri Enterprise is just kind of a lot of the under the hood engineering is done for you, and you put in your maps, you maybe tell it, this is the port I want to, put this website at, and you're off and going, right? To build what we're talking about in open source as possible, you're going to be investing in engineering time instead of enterprise licensing.
Yeah.
Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Yeah, and that's the key thing because enterprise architects can be relatively expensive. I think I was having a look a couple of weeks ago, and in the UK, it's something of the order of £100,000 a year, to employ a geospatial enterprise architect. Um, Yet a Esri Enterprise license is on its own not that much per year.
Right.
So yeah, it's interesting the trade-off and where you would start making more money, abandoning your Esri Enterprise subscription. It sounds like you might need to have a few projects going.
Right. And or, you happen to find the right staff, right? I mean, I think that's what a lot of people find is, if you've got someone on your engineering team and they already have some
Right.
knowledge of these tools, that, that
Okay.
bootstraps you into the next level. And we see a lot of that, right? Where, oh, we just hired this guy. We actually hired him to help with some of this other stuff, but he knows about open source. We're going to try this new thing in open source and see if we can get started.
Okay, yeah. And so I guess because I did mention sort of a medium-sized engineering consultancy. So, if you go for sort of, I don't know, 1,000 to 5,000 staff, typically they will have some sort of enterprise architect because there's plenty of enterprise software beyond geospatial that a company like
Right.
that would have. So
Right.
yeah, yep, you're right to mention that. Yep. Okay. All right, so then about 10% of such web maps go beyond viewing and include editing workflows in the browser or from the field, such as in ecology surveys or, in your case, archaeology surveys. So what does your PostGIS implementation offer here?
So QGIS is the way that I've seen people do this. There are a couple ways that you can do field implementations. There's a plugin to QGIS called QField
I've
that
heard of it.
is pretty popular. I think that's what the most people are using. I know there's also a project called, I think, Mergen Maps. I think they offer kind of a similar thing. That that may be like a third party like paid service, and that helps you kind of, you do some of that and then your data ends up in PostGIS. So yeah, I think it's probably I mean, that is available. Those things are possible. There's a wide variety of how people get data in, right? But the field data I think is being done through QField.
Okay, and what about a web map? Is it routine to enable editing against a vector data layer using open or OSGeo tooling?
Yeah, yes, I would say yes.
Okay, cool. All right. So bear in mind that Esri offers a solution that requires practically no knowledge of computer science. So realistically, how far could the average Esri technician get setting all this up? What do they have to start learning and where can they do that? Tips about communities are welcome.
Yeah, so that's a big question, right? And I think something the whole open source community is sort of grappling with is how do we get better at that education piece and how do we onboard people holistically? So, I mean, you can definitely find tutorials for all of this stuff. Matt Forrest, who used to be a developer advocate at Cardo, who's now at Whereabots, has an amazing body of YouTube content that'll kind of help you get started with QGIS. I think he even has like a QGIS in 5 minutes, right?
Yeah.
He's got some really good beginner PostGIS stuff. But it's open source and it's pretty DIY, right? You're going to be kind of figuring this out. You're going to be experimenting with local tools. You're going to be kind of watching some YouTube videos, reading through docs. The PostGIS project has a tutorial that's pretty good. The open source Geospatial Foundation itself has a meeting in North America every year in the fall. They just had theirs in St. Louis, and next year it'll be in DC. And then they have a big one in Europe. And I know they also have some things happening in South America too.
Yeah.
Um, their conferences usually start with tutorial days. And if you really are like, I need to bootstrap myself into PostGIS or QGIS, the tutorial days are the way to do it. I just did a QGIS like half day tutorial and it was like amazing. And I know QGIS, right? But I don't know like how to make everything look amazing in QGIS. And it was like so helpful. But yeah, so you're probably going to a conference if you want to bootstrap yourself in a couple days.
Yeah.
The FOSS4G conferences are a great place to see what other people are doing, to go to talks, find out how people have put these tool chains together. Like I was saying, there's a lot of choices, right? Like unlike with an Esri setup.
Yes.
Yeah. So seeing, going to talks, seeing how people are setting this stuff up is helpful. Yeah, I think those are the high points, but yeah.
Cool. Okay. All right. I do have one final question, but there's something that's come up. If you don't mind me asking something without warning.
Sure.
Yeah, so I was actually in Atlanta last week just to scope out what the city is like ahead of a possible move. And I didn't know this, but actually the airport there is the largest and most and busiest in the world. And as I was walking through, I saw all sorts of construction work going on. And it made me think, there must be, because that must, if you look at it from satellite imagery, it's larger than a lot of towns, the extent of the airport. And then there must be an incredible system just for controlling and administering those works and ensuring that they're safe, that they're coordinated, the right project happens at the right time, et cetera, et cetera. So it just made me think that this could be a cool way to, within a defined space, but where there's a lot going on, demonstrate the power of an open source solution for managing the spatial expression of all of those works. And even there's the program of works too. Because if you think about all the different contractors that, Atlanta Airport must be using to, I don't know, maintain this part of this runway, do these works on this control tower, cut the grass, which I imagine is its own imported program that has to happen at a certain time and in certain places. So if one was to engage Crunchy Data on behalf of something like Atlanta Airport and say, hey guys, we want a map that shows in a live fashion connected to the program of work software where all of the projects are happening across the world's busiest airport. If this is enough information to get you going, how long might Crunchy Data take to set up a database backend and ultimately to support a front-end web map for showing all these projects connected to a program of works, which is its own database,
Right.
And software, along with an editable layer for people to delineate where all of these projects are going to be? Is that enough detail to sort of get a sense for how long it might take?
I mean, I think I'm going
We're
to let
talking
you
a
down
month,
here.
a week.
Yeah,
Sure.
I'm going to let you down here in that really Crunchy Data is a data storage service provider, right?
Okay.
We're not in the business of building maps. We're not in the business of engineering maps. We're in the infrastructure tool chain piece of it. So a project like that, if someone came to Crunchy Data, we would work with some kind of third party, probably a consulting company, right? And we do a lot in this industry. And so we have a lot of friends in consulting companies that we could probably hook somebody up with. I mean, the short answer is depending on what you need. I mean, I managed a lot of open source projects for a lot of years, and I would never tell you to start with that big of a project in mind. I mean, if you have that big of a project in mind, that's great. I would tell you to build a proof of concept or an MVP or whatever, tool of the term of the day that you want to use. But I would, in open source, it's fast to bootstrap that stuff, right? To get a data storage set up, to start delivering maps and layers, to start, kind of delivering those front end pieces. You could definitely have, some kind of proof of concept up for the type of project you're talking about in a couple weeks with the right engineering team, right?
Yeah. So we're talking a team of 5, a team of 2.
I think you're talking 1 or 2 people for a proof of concept, and then, to build the full thing that you're talking about, obviously you're scoping that out, and that's a bigger thing. But if you just want to see like what's possible, how could I get this started, you could get pretty far with a proof of concept in a couple weeks.
Cool. There you go. It's nice to have a sense.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. All right. So then the last question is, if Crunchy Data were to hire an apprentice, what qualities would get them the job?
Yeah, we do a lot of different stuff at Crunchy Data. We do get Google Summer of Code people occasionally, and they typically help with open source projects. So that's how we've used those resources in the past. But Crunchy Data does a lot of stuff. We do a lot of productizing of software. So that's an area where you could help. We do a lot of engineering on a lot of very back-end components, right, that manage big, giant, thousands of databases, to, engineering little front-end components that help make our software work. Like if people want to get in and buy a database, if you're interested in the front-end pieces of that, that's available. Or if you're interested in some of the back-end stuff, we have lots of stuff like that. And then all this, geospatial stuff that we're doing, there's places for those people too.
Yep. Okay, great. Sounds like there's plenty of opportunities there. And you have had, some decent interns, it sounds.
So I did want to mention, like before our time wraps up, that we host a PostGIS day. So not the GIS day is November 20th. And then the post GIS day is the day after that, November 21st.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's so
and
brilliant.
so this is an online, it's like on Zoom. You can find information about it if you just Google Post GIS Day 2024. And it's, I think I just sent out all the talk acceptances yesterday, but it'll be something like 20, 22 talks. They're a half hour long. You can kind of come and go as you please. It's on Zoom. And so you could, leave your second monitor, your third monitor running, and kind of see what's going on at Post GIS Day. So big range of people are coming to, some of them are Crunchy data clients that talk about, how they're using Crunchy tools. I'll have a talk on feature serve and tile serve and just like the little basic setups if you want to know about that. And then lots of kind of other users in the space will talk about what they've built, how they built it, and then kind of what they're doing with PostGIS. So that's kind of a big part of this open source world is kind of these sort of opportunities to kind of share in a bigger community.
Yep. That's brilliant. I'll make sure to promote that via the podcast newsletter,
Okay.
LinkedIn, things like that. That's great.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks.
Awesome, Elizabeth. Well, it was a privilege to have that insight. And I honestly look forward to exploring more. So
Awesome.
yeah, if people want to get in touch,
find me.
How would people do
I'm
that?
everywhere. I'm on all the social media platforms. My handle is SQL Liz, SQLLIZ, and I'm on LinkedIn. My name's Elizabeth Garrett Christensen. So
there we go.
I think I'm the only one.
Okay. If I could ask one more,
Sure.
if you could put in a word with Matt Forrest for me, I'd appreciate it.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, sure. But first, go through all of Matt's YouTube videos and learn. If you
20 hours later.
I mean, it's more than that. Have you seen how much stuff he has? He has hundreds of hours. Like it's
all right.
Yeah, no, he's great and his stuff is great.
Okay, so after a significant amount of annual leave, maybe a sabbatical, I will have earned the right he can then be the next to carry on this topic. So hopefully.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for hosting a geospatial podcast.
Likewise.
This is cool. I before I was introduced to you, I didn't even know there was a geospatial podcast. So definitely there's a need for it, right? Like there's enough people doing geospatial stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I want you to know that I got through 10% of the notes I had for this meeting.
Oh my God.
So if you want, I have a lot of notes about geospatial analytics, and I'm ready to talk about. Yeah, I think that's a huge topic, which maybe you could get Whereabots or somebody else to talk about, but this is a big thing,
so
right?
I did already have them on, and yet, I mean, if I'm honest, I feel like I need to quit my job because there needs to be almost daily commentary. I mean, there's like GeoBiz or something, Geospatial World. They almost have like a TV presenter style vibe on YouTube.
Oh, okay.
But so, I mean, I feel like I'm about to start another episode with you, but just to touch on it about, because you mentioned analytics. There is this emerging theme and this advocacy group called Cloud Native Geospatial. At least I've seen them on LinkedIn, and it's really exciting. But what you bring up analytics makes me think, well, there should be another episode just about how open source, the open source opportunities for, or how you avoid the expensive hyperscalers, but still enable cloud native geospatial for your organization. So it would be awesome at some point to discuss that too.
Have you looked into DuckDB at all? Are you?
Yeah. So
okay.
I had,
so you know about
Stephanie
the Duck.
May
okay. Because everything is it's a very ducky world right now. Like it is hard to get through a day at my job where we're not talking about DuckDB. Like it is the hotness in the database world and in the geospatial world. It's very popular.
Could you just describe it in a sentence of what that is for listeners?
Yeah. So at a super high level, DuckDB is a way to query flat files in object storage or not in object storage. So CSV files, XML files, JSON files, you can query them with DuckDB. And since it's flat file, it's, columnar, queries, and it's vectorized, right? So it's much faster than your traditional row by row query engine. But yeah, so, lots of folks are kind of in this, are embedding DuckDB into products. And we've just embedded DuckDB into in a Postgres product that we sell, and it also has spatial capabilities. So you can read GeoParquet and GeoJSON, and this opens up a whole big world of reading stuff like overture maps, which we didn't talk about at all, but definitely
it's another whole episode.
Yeah, this is like a whole separate episode, but overture maps is coming to PostGIS Day, so
awesome.
That'll be cool to hear more about, kind of what they're doing and how that's all going to fit together with PostGIS.
All right. Well,
but yeah. All right. Sorry to waylay you.
That's fine. This is, okay. All right. Well, that was just an amazing tour, Elizabeth. And I'm definitely going to be coming back to you for more.
Okay. Yeah. It's great to meet you. Thanks for having me.
Okay. All right. Cheers.